Listeners, readers, welcome to the Foxed Page, where we dive deep into the very best books. You'll come away with a richer understanding of the text at hand while learning to read everything a little bit better. I'm Kimberly Ford, best-selling author, one-time adjunct professor at Berkeley, lecturer, editor, and PhD in literature. I'm really excited today to dive into Claire Dederer's book, Monsters, A Fan's Dilemma. Those of you who've been following the Fox Page for a long time and who've been attending my lectures live know that I really have a strong preference. Well, it's not even a preference, it's that I always seem to be really involved with fiction. And here today we are diving into some really, really important, very theoretical and very timely nonfiction. But it's sort of a cheat because I have arrived at this incredible book by Claire Dederer because of fiction. I found Monsters, A Fan's Dilemma in the New York Times Book Review, and the person who was reviewing it said, in fact, that Claire Dederer offers what he considered, I'm not sure this was his words, but it was the way that I remember them, a very salient defense of Lolita. It's a book that I have loved for many, many decades and have been so sad about the idea of not being able to read it with any kind of clear conscience, and then also not being able to share it in this forum to sort of dive into why the prose is so incredible. She was just touching on some artists who are very close to my heart, and in fact, I was so impressed by Dederer's analysis, which is astute and careful and really, sort of hard won by having thought about these questions for a long time and having grappled with them at a very sort of tumultuous time for this question of what we do when reprehensible people make great art. Let's go ahead and just dive right on to Monsters, A Fan's Dilemma. I just realized as I was pulling this lecture together that I had done no research on Claire Dederer's biography. Usually I give you guys a little snippet about the biography. I think it's actually interesting that in fact I did not do that with Dederer because her entire book is about sort of this inability to really to divorce ourselves from the biography of any given artist. I heard an interview with her just recently where she was, the interviewer had asked about her thoughts on Taylor Swift's recent breakup with her boyfriend, and Dederer laughed because she said she follows these things carefully because they come up a lot in her sort of professional life. And, her point was that, among many others, but the one that is most salient at this moment was this idea that, who cares who this Maddie blah, blah, blah guy is and why do we know about him? But the fact is we do. And we know that Taylor Swift, I'm not a huge Taylor Swift stan, but, I know a lot of people who are very invested in her. And, when you know that information, which is just, you're barraged with it, how racist and anti-Semitic her boyfriend might be, given the media, it's impossible to sort of undo the emotional impact. Apparently, recently, Taylor also broke up with this Maddie guy, so I don't know, I think all of the Swifties, is that what they're called? I feel like they could maybe, just feel a little bit better about their Taylor. But back to Nabokov and back to Dederer. I'm going to back up a little bit, though, because one of the things that Dederer does so well is she really does define her terms. A monster is someone whose behavior disrupts our ability to appreciate the work on its own terms. It's a very specific and a very important thing to keep in mind as we move forward. So this idea of who is a monster, it really comes down to this idea of any artist whose behavior is such that we can't appreciate the art on its own terms. She begins the book with Roman Polanski. And again, I love this idea of really digging into this notion of like, what are we supposed to do with this art? And through the past, many years, I think we have all done our own calculus, this very sort of pragmatic thing that we all were doing, that I know I was doing for a long time, specifically with Woody Allen and also with Nabokov and a little bit with Alice Walker, who is anti-Semitic. I once taught The Color Purple and had all sorts of angst because I literally did not know that she was anti-Semitic. And there's nothing in that incredible novel to point to the fact that Alice Walker is anti-Semitic. But literally one of the attendees, said something about how she hoped I would address the anti-Semitism. And I was like, maybe this is like niche information. Maybe not everybody has this information. And I went to the Wikipedia page, and it's literally like on her Wikipedia page in bold. You can like click on it, and it's, about how she believes that crazy guy who thinks that Jewish people are like lizards from the I don't know, from outer space or something. The conclusion that we came to, and this was many years ago when things were very fraught about teaching anything or reading anything or buying anything that was made by someone who had any sort of, smirch on their anti-Semitism is not really a smirch. That's like a moral kind of failing. In my opinion, and Dieter and I both are very clear about my opinion is my opinion. But the color purple is such an incredible work, and it's such an important work, and it was so engaging and so rich a text to dive into that we went ahead and we discussed, I lectured a bit about this problematic, later anti-Semitism, but we looked at the text a little more like I would have in graduate school, which is divorcing the text, in fact, from the biography of the author. So Dieter does this kind of pragmatic thing. Can you love art that was made before the crime? Can you, what if we don't buy anything from this person? What if we're not, kind of padding the wallets? That's not a term, but you know what I mean. If we're not sort of financially supporting even like the estate of Norman Mailer, or if we are not, in fact, buying copies of The Color Purple. That was an issue that I had because I was, in fact, asking, I think there were like 85 people signed up, and they were purchasing a copy of the book. So that was part of their $48 fee, and I was like, oh my God, I'm adding to the fortune of an anti-Semite. But there is this question of like, is that okay? Is that not okay? And one thing that I really love about the Dieter book, which we're going to come to in the very end, is she has an approach, I think, that was very freeing. Part of the reason why I wanted to dig in. One of the conclusions that she comes to in this kind of examination is something I was just touching on, which is this idea of this is a highly, highly personal process. So, I think we have this idea of like, what are global consumers supposed to do with Woody Allen or Louis C.K. or Harvey Weinstein? It's sort of like we have this responsibility. And what Dieter does is realize that it's not really a question of we, it's a question of I. It's how do I feel about this? What emotions is this evoking in me? This idea of what is reprehensible is highly emotional. It's every person's individual decision. And then she goes one step further, but we're gonna save that for a little bit later. She does touch on women, but she makes a very persuasive argument that this idea of the art monster, which is a term that she got from Jenny Offel, that these art monsters essentially can do anything in the name of art. So if you're Bon Jovi, I don't know anything really about Bon Jovi, but like if you're, I don't know, if you're Anthony Kiedis of the Red Hot Chili Peppers, you can do drugs and you can trash hotel rooms and you can have sex with women you don't know at all who are half your age. You can do all of that stuff. And somehow it's fine because it's, considered genius, and it's just sort of part of that persona. So this idea of the art monster, and I think building on Jenny Offel's idea, Dieter makes the distinction that a lot of women simply don't have that freedom because women didn't have that freedom in the first place, just because we live in a patriarchy. There are also women who are reprehensible, who create amazing art, but more often than not, this like really sort of fulsome example of these art monsters happen to be men. It's not a coincidence because they do in fact have more freedoms to begin with and can exercise those freedoms with a bit more abandon than a woman who is shooting drugs and trashing hotel rooms and having sex with men half her age. It's kind of an interesting mental exercise. I think that probably doesn't work for women. Certainly not if you're like married and a mom. But it's an interesting concept to sort of think about here. So I want to touch quickly on Dieter's take on Woody Allen, because Woody Allen very much for me, like Virginia Woolf, very different artists, certainly, But I feel like Virginia Woolf with her stream of consciousness, when I first read her when I was 17 years old, I felt like someone had literally gotten inside my brain and somehow had access to the way that my thoughts worked and the way that my mind worked and the way that language is present in my brain. It was the most incredible revelation. And I felt the same way about Woody Allen movies, but because of the neuroses. I am someone who is highly neurotic. So I really, really identified with Woody, with this kind of nebbishy, kind of, anxious, hypochondriac. I don't think I'm a hypochondriac actually, but like, all the rest of his kind of, sort of brainy, sort of bumbly, sort of professorial kind of thing. Not to mention New York City, and not to mention, this sort of intellectual milieu that Woody Allen was promoting. I just kind of didn't notice the fact that almost every one of his movies had some really disgusting older dude kind of preying on a younger woman. So we're going to look at page 22 here. This is Dieter talking about Annie Hall, and I love this. So Diane Keaton, who, check back to the Fox page soon because I'm going to be doing a couple of deep dives into a couple of her memoirs. I love Diane Keaton. I have a picture of her in my kitchen. She's one of my style icons. I also loved her memoirs, and I love so much of what she does. I did just try to watch Book Club 2, the next chapter, and have to say, even with my beloved Diane, I had to turn that guy off. I bailed after I don't know, half hour. Once they decide to go to Venice and they're just going to wander around looking at stuff, I was like, oh my God, not even Mary Steenburgen and Candice Bergen and Jane Fonda can keep me in this moment, let alone Diane. But this estimation of Annie Hall was so gratifying for me. So I want to just read you some of what she has to say because I find it so, just so excellent. Here's what Dieter says. Everything about Diane Keaton's performance in Annie Hall is inimitable. And we know that for a fact because what happened next was that every woman in America went around trying to imitate her and failed. 100% true. Upstairs in my closet, I've got a couple of vests that I actually think I wear sort of well. I just could not pull off the slouchy tie, and I certainly couldn't pull off the slouchy hat. But every vest I have, and whenever I'm, which is almost always, doing all black or black and white or something, it's a nod to Diane and to Annie Hall. In fact, a bit further down, Annie Hall is the greatest comic film of the 20th century. Better than Bringing Up Baby, better even than Caddyshack, because it acknowledges the irrepressible nihilism lurking at the center of all comedy. Also, it's really funny. I love this. So this is that voice that Claire Dieter has talked about, this idea of sort of not making a big pronouncement and not saying this is great art. But here I love this because even as she is saying to us, nobody really has the authority to say that unless you have unless you're speaking from a place of I, so that the reader, this is how I interpret it, that the reader has some sense of who this person is who is making this pronouncement. So when she says, Annie Hall is the greatest comic film of the 20th century, that is a major pronouncement, and I loved it. I was like, yes, Claire Dieter, you are correct. You are 100% correct. So it seemed like it ran a little contrary to some of her arguments, but I also really loved the fact that if you are coming from this place of revealing some of yourself and your biases and your preferences, then I think you can cogently make an argument, especially if you have given a lot of data about the film itself. So she goes around, she goes down a little further. I'm going down a little further, and she says, look, I don't get to go around feeling connected to humanity all the time. It's a rare pleasure. And I was supposed to give it up just because Woody Allen behaved like a terrible person? It hardly seemed fair. Love it. Love it. I read that, and I might have been just as happy about that as I was about the idea that she was going to defend Lolita for me. So I was so pleased, but I also was like, uh-oh, okay, but what do we do? I still don't know what to do. And predictably then she goes on to talk about this idea of how a lot of what Woody Allen is doing is very difficult to watch because, if you look at Manhattan, for example, with Mariel Hemingway, a movie that I really, really loved and I've watched at least a dozen times, it is a movie without having read the Dieter yet, I did try to revisit that movie at one point, and just was so uncomfortable. And it is an interesting phenomenon, this idea of just like not just listening to your own reaction. Just this afternoon, I'm gonna sit down and treat myself to Annie Hall. And I am fully expecting to just love it. And to love it, frankly, with a clear conscience because of this book by Claire Dieter. That is the gift that Claire Dieter has for you. We're gonna look at one more quotation here from her book on 38 and 39. I can barely read in this light. The light is just really not, I should just get my glasses. I should just go ahead and do that. Importantly, so what's happening here is she's also talking about this idea of like what it is that is happening when we are like, oh, I can't watch Manhattan. Like, ugh, that older dude, the bald one, I don't remember his name right now, but you're like, ooh, that's terrible. A very important thing is happening, and this is the kind of very incisive analysis that Dieter really, really does well. So she's going one step deeper. You're not just like, ew, gross, Manhattan's gross, I can watch Annie Hall and not Manhattan. She goes on to say the following: when you're having a moral feeling, self-congratulation is never far behind. You are setting your emotion in a bed of ethical language, and you are admiring yourself doing it. Down a little further. Remember, not you, not we, but I. Stop sidestepping ownership. I am the audience, and I can sense that there's something entirely unacceptable lurking inside me. So we go down a little further. I suppose this is the human condition, this sneaking suspicion of our own badness. It lies at the heart of our fascination with people who do awful things. Something in us, in me, chimes to that awfulness, recognizes it in myself, is horrified by that recognition, and then thrills to the drama of loudly denouncing the monster in question. This impulse to blame the other guy is in fact a political impulse. I talked earlier about the word we. We can be an escape hatch from responsibility. It can be a megaphone, but it can also be a casting out, us against them, the morally correct people against the immoral ones, the process of making someone else wrong so that we may be more right. So I love this idea of, when I say, ew, I can't watch Manhattan, that's so gross, it's just reprehensible that he, especially with all of Woody Allen's biography and having married, the adopted child of his girlfriend, his longtime girlfriend. I think she was actually, I don't think he adopted Soon-Yi. I am enjoying the fact that I don't have that information embedded in my brain. But when we say that is reprehensible, he is a monster, there is a part of us that's saying like, that's not me. This idea of like, I would never be that. And in fact, I would go one step further and be like, ugh, like none of the men that I know would be doing that, which is probably not true. She talks in the beginning of the book about Roman Polanski and how one of the things that he says, and Woody Allen echoes it, is essentially that like everyone wants to be having sex with young girls. This is something Polanski said. And then famously, Woody Allen said, the heart wants what it wants. There's this idea of, it's right up there with like boys will be boys, but this concept of these impulses, like these very dark things that are lurking inside of us. And when we say that is a monster, there is that fascination. It's exactly the reason why I love television where bad people are doing bad things. My husband is maybe like a better person than I am because he's just always like, every single person is awful. There's not one redeeming person in there. And I'm like, exactly. I love it. I love it. Get me some more Succession. Get me more Julia Louis-Dreyfus being absolutely terrible to her daughter on Veep. Like those impulses, a lot of it for me, I think, is wish fulfillment. I tend to be someone, I'm such a pleaser that I tend to not, just like let loose with my daughter, and just like tell her, I can't even begin to sort of emulate the sort of critical and really bold parenting that is happening on Veep. But I will say that I am very in touch with the fact that I really love watching people behave badly. I love it. Do I love it in real life when it is one of my most esteemed movie makers? I almost said my most esteemed loves. wow. I mean, that is a, Woody himself with his Freudian situation would really have a heyday with that. What I meant is, my beloved movie makers. So it's very important what Dieter is doing here, and often she will take things one step further. So she does that very cool thing where she's talking about, it doesn't seem fair that I can't watch Annie Hall. And in fact, if we go to this place of individual, sort of emotion, and we're in touch with our own reaction to something, then and then take it one further and say, this is also this othering where I'm like, oh, you're a monster and I'm actually morally superior to you. Then we can start thinking about these pieces of art and these artists, I think, with a little more nuance in a way that is very important. Okay, now we are going to get to the sort of main attraction for me in some ways, which is her reading of Nabokov. And she does this very, very cool thing where she calls, so the chapter that she goes into with Nabokov is called The Anti-Monster. It's such a good argument, and it's, I think, kind of watertight and bulletproof. I just was so happy that it was so cogent and so well supported, because in fact, I love Lolita, and I'm very happy about the idea of feeling free to, just cry that love from the mountaintops. Okay. A book from the past that is almost universally perceived to be a problem is Lolita. We approach it tentatively, afraid to poke the beast. For Lolita, over the decades, has been alchemized into something truly strange, a text that is perceived in and of itself as an act of abuse. It's true. And then she goes on to say, Humbert, the child rapist, is so perfectly and totally depicted that he's become mixed up with his author. Only a monster could know a monster so well. Surely Lolita must be some kind of mirror of its author. Okay, so I like this because she's setting up this idea that we all think. I mean, there is this incredible conflation, and we're going to get into it when I do my actual deep dive into Lolita, which I'm really excited about doing. But Dieter explains right here, it has a lot to do with the first person narrator. Okay, so, and she read it when I think she was 12 or 13, and she had just read The Great Gatsby and was feeling very like adult and like ready to tackle something. And here's how it went. Well, I was horrified. Most of it was repellent, and even the non-repellent parts were upsetting. Why did Lolita have so many names? She hardly seemed like a character at all. You never learned any real information about her. You never learned her point of view. So one of the most important things that Dieter does is talk about the way that this first-person narration, which is so compelling and so well done and so rich and so complete and so psychopathic, it does make us do this weird conflation. Also, I think it doesn't help or hurt that both of those things, talk about ambivalent, that Nabokov, I mean, I think a lot of people, well, a lot of people don't know how to pronounce his name because he is an exiled Russian emigre. Like he's like I think we think of, I mean, he is like kind of like this like Russian, like upper class, he grew up speaking French and English and Russian and emigrate, he moved to Paris and to Berlin, and he, was in Switzerland for a long time. Like this very kind of cosmopolitan, very non-American, person. And then, so I think in lots of ways, it's very tempting as an American to sort of conflate Humbert, who is also an emigre from New York. I mean, from Europe to the United States. It's very easy to conflate them. And I think Nabokov actually invites a lot of that conflation. She goes on to say, Nabokov shows us men having sex with very young girls, or trying to have sex with very young girls, or trying, not very hard, not to have sex with very young girls. Yet there is no evidence at all that Nabokov himself was a pedophile in his inmost heart. Nabokov himself, of course, would have had contempt for any attempt to guess what was in his heart. She's right about that. Nabokov, he was a very savvy, very smart dude who would have thought that was silly. Even the idea of Nabokov having a heart is a bit hard to imagine. I love that. Although I don't really agree with it. I love him so much that I personally really can imagine him having a heart. I like to think it was mostly for his wife, Vera, his wife of many, many years. But I have to finish this paragraph. She says, even the idea of Nabokov having a heart is a bit hard to imagine. This reader wonders if maybe he had novels instead of a heart, which is incredible. And I love that use of this reader because, again, she's getting us in this kind of funky third person semantic, structure, getting us to this idea of herself. This is Claire Dieter who has this idea, but it's also very Nabokovian, this idea of like having a novel instead of a heart. But in fact, when I say that I think his heart belonged to Vera, that is coming from having read many a biography about him and about Vera and having read their letters. And he did have an affair, and Vera knew about it or found out about it, and they stayed together and they were married forever and they had one child. And so I think there's, again, if you're hungry for biography and you get biography, that of course is fallible, although again, I had many different sources that I was working from. By all accounts, biographical book accounts, he was a fairly devoted married man. All of his books are dedicated to Vera, he was incredibly dependent on her, and she was incredibly, they were very together as a couple. So my sense is that, he was not having sex with young girls, but it was certainly a preoccupation, and we do see it a lot in his novels. But because he did not, like Woody Allen, did not marry Woody Allen married Soon Yi, there is no Soon Yi in the life of Nabokov, thank God. So then Dieter goes on to talk about rereading the book. And this is when I was I was excited because when she read it as a child, did not sit well with her. But then she goes on to say here, I was forced by the prose into recognition of the greatness, the intentionality of the book. Nothing here was an accident. We don't need to commit the intentional fallacy in order to wonder what Nabokov was up to. And that is true. When we look at the book, we're going to look closely at the many, many times that he says he was depraved and he was psychopathic and he was sick and he was a monster. I mean, he's telling us over and over and over again that what he's doing is terrible, but he's telling it to us in the most incredible prose, readers. Oh my God, it's the most engaging. I mean, you have to be ready to read a book that's the confession of a psychopath, but it is someone who is definitely recognizing a lot of what Dieter is telling us here. A little further along, to put it another way, why did Nabokov, possessor of one of the most beautiful and supple and just plain funny prose styles in the modern English language, spend so much time and energy on this asshole? So that's the question Claire Dieter is asking. I have to say, I never asked that question. When I first read Lolita, I was probably in my early 20s, maybe, and it didn't bother me. I mean, that's kind of scary, and kind of gross, but it didn't. And frankly, I think I was so enchanted by the prose. I think I was so taken by I was also, I think, taken by the fact that, they're not graphic sex scenes, much to many readers' dismay. It's a horrific tale, but it's also one that is very upfront about the horrificness of it. It's not trying to convince us. Humbert is not trying to convince us that he is an innocent man. He does try to convince us that he loves Lolita, which you're going to have to make up your mind about that after you read the book, if you want to read the book. But I was so taken by the prose that piece of the story, which is obviously the central piece of the story, was gross and abhorrent, but so was, In Cold Blood. And so there are a lot of things that we read that are really disturbing. White Noise by Don DeLillo is literally the only book I couldn't finish because I was so upset by it. But we choose to read books that are terrible. I mean, meaning we also choose to read books that are terrible. But we choose to read books that are telling us about terrible things. That is not, I mean, we just went over this idea of being fascinated by people who behave really badly. This is, my experience of it was I was so starstruck by the prose that I just was able to kind of assimilate this in a way that Dieter is talking about here. His language trumpets its own distinction. It's language with a great PR team. Incredible. So great. Claire Dieter this lady's a wordsmith here. Woman. Humbert famously says, you can always count on a murderer for a fancy prose style. And then a little further down, this is important. In reality, as Polanski indicated, Humbert is far from special. Not a singular monster, but just a run-of-the-mill child abuser. So, and this is a very important part of the book. So what he is doing ultimately is writing the confession of someone who is a child abuser. And God knows there are plenty of those in the real world. I mean, this is not some particular situation that Nabokov, this is not some, like, no one's ever heard of this before. It happens all the time. But what we are getting here is this very engaging prose confession on the part of someone who is depraved, in fact. And the book is so good, in my opinion. And then a little bit further down, she says, Humbert, in fact, realizes his own ordinariness in the end. The realization of his ordinariness, that cannot be how you say ordinariness. Ordinariness? I guess so. The realization of his ordinariness comes contemporaneously with the realization that he has destroyed Lolita. So this was, Claire Dieter is so genius. So the argument that she is making here, and I'm going to read a couple more lines about it, but I'm going to boil it down for you here, is that what happens when a child is abused is you rob that child of their childhood, which is exactly what Humbert does. And as soon as I read that, and then I went back and reread Lolita, I was so struck by what an incredible, article I had in my hands for the experience of child abuse. I just had this sense of, like, how absolutely depraved, Humbert was, and how absolutely victimized Lolita is. And in a way that generated so much compassion in me, not for Humbert, just compassion for Lolita. And I was more moved than ever by the plight of this young girl because of Dieter's excellent argument. She goes on and says in a voice that is, again, this kind of pronouncement that I really like when she makes these pronouncements, because, again, I feel like she has earned them and she's backing them up well. She says, child rape is not just a sexual act, but the thievery of childhood itself. The annihilation of personhood is the act's terrible trace. So she goes on to give a couple of examples of how we find Lolita, or we don't find Lolita. We find Lolita absent from the novel. So it's this incredible kind of, Nabokov is very well known for wordplay and for very convoluted plots, and Lolita has a lot of plot. But he's very well known for very sophisticated structures. So to think that Humbert, our sort of the attention that we pay to him and the way that we are, well, I personally was enchanted by his prose, and also just absolutely it's so cringe, it's so gross and terrible, but it's so beautiful as prose that you kind of can't look away. Dieter, not only did she defend the book, but she allowed me to have this much deeper understanding, frankly, of the genius of the text, which I really appreciated. And then she goes one step further and talks about, and I love this part predictably too, talks about the fact that Nabokov likely, had a good handle on this. She says, because the great writer trusts that the most terrible feeling is hardly unique. The great writer knows that even the blackest thoughts are ordinary. It's so good. It's so good. So I want to close with this sort of thing that I was promising earlier, and I'm going to really just boil it down here and state it in my own words, that it is not my job or your job or our job as consumers to sort of take some kind of moral high ground and to sort of do something that's like an ethical act, you know, and deprive ourselves of this work. But it's an individual thing. We each get to decide what we are going to do, but it is not our problem to solve. So, and she goes on to say, in fact, that, you know, she still hopes that there will be, you know, ways to solve these problems. But the idea that we as like an individual consumer somehow need to act, you know, make a moral stand by consuming or not consuming art, her sense there is that, whoa, sorry, I just almost knocked over my whole entire, you should see the setup I've got here. I've got a bar stool and then another stool and a bunch of books and everything. It's, anyway. But this idea that, you know, that I, as a consumer, that is not the way I'm going to solve the problem. There are other things that I might be able to do, but if I sit down this afternoon and watch Annie Hall, it doesn't really matter in the much bigger scheme of things. I think this is right. I think I'm going to say this. It doesn't matter if I had to go buy Annie Hall again. I don't have to, because I've owned it for a zillion years, and so I can very freely feel, you know, like I can read it. But would I, you know, would I buy it? I probably would. I don't like the idea of Woody Allen's bad behavior as depriving me of one of the movies that I still might be able to enjoy. So I love the freedom that Dieter gives us to really understand that these are not logical questions. And yes, you can be pragmatic and you can decide exactly what you don't want to watch and what you do want to watch and hum along to a Kanye song if you want to. It's not the individual problem to solve. There are some very large problems that we need to solve, but it's not my individual problem to decide if something should be consumed and how it should be consumed. So I am going to take a bit of a stand, though, and say that I would love it if you wanted to tune in to hear about Lolita. If you are someone who loves prose and have been avoiding the book, I mean, to be clear, again, you do have to be ready to read the story of a psychopath. Like, you have to be ready to read incredibly beautiful, incredibly inventive, incredibly well-structured plot and prose, and oh my God, I mean, it is so smart. In fact, you should read the annotated version because it's so smart that you will miss a lot of stuff if you do not. But I hope that you maybe, if it sounds great to read about a psychopath, or read sort of the inner confession of a psychopath, I hope that you join me. I really appreciate Claire Dieter being able to, or having given me the gift, not only to think about Nabokov and Woody Allen a little bit more clearly, but to have really thought through this question in a very important way, and to have given us also a memoir that is so revealing and so interesting and so thought-provoking and well done, but also that you know, it feels really like you are talking with a friend, which is just such a gift. So get this book, get Claire Dieter's Monsters, A Fan's Dilemma. My daughter actually had a copy of this. She has the other cover, which I think on some level is kind of even cooler. One of my sons loves this cover. We had a little debate about whose cover was better, but doesn't matter. You can choose whichever cover you want, but definitely get yourself a copy of Claire Dieter's Monsters, A Fan's Dilemma. It's a very incisive look at a really important question. Okay, happy reading.